I would just start with sort of a message of solidarity and congratulations to Gladwell for being so consistent in the leadership that she and AfriCOG provide in the kind of conversations that we are having today, and the one that we had last week when we launched the other report on Kenya's indebtedness to China. These are examples of the extremely useful leadership that AfriCOG has provided in this space. AfriCOG is important because they document when people speak. Finally, once it is written down, it elevates the conversations to new levels. It enables us to have engagements with policymakers, and the work that they do also enables us to marshal the evidence necessary for the kind of activism and action that is needed to try and make the change that the change happen. And also to thank Mwalimu for being such a gem for such a long time. His thoughtfulness and the kind of high-level high-level information that he provides in these types of spaces is also rare and a needed quality for the kind of work that we are trying to do. So I'm old enough to, as Gladwell has said, to have been involved in some of the previous conversations on anti-corruption in the country, going back to the Golden Bag scandal. When Golden Bag was first discovered, it became the subject of very, very significant media coverage. There was in the nation at the time a serialization of the details of the Golden Bag scandal. Every day it was serialized by Sarah Elderkin. If you're old enough, you remember that. And there was massive public interest in the Golden Bag and its details when it first broke out. I believe that was 1991. It stayed in the public mind at the time as an example of the organization of high-level corruption. And that early effort of 1991, 1992 is what finally leads to the Commission of Inquiry when Kibaki takes power 10 years later. Let's go back to that documentation that had happened 10 years earlier to see whether the public what can be done about bringing accountability in relation to the Golden Bag, what actually happened in Golden Bag. Unfortunately, when Kibaki takes power in 2002, from 2005, just 2 years later, we get the Anglo-leasing scandal, which is also a high-level, a high-profile, extremely expensive scandal that Kibaki inherited from the Moi regime, but which his own government continues to perpetuate. And that also has a lot of public attention at the time. The reason why those two scandals got as much attention as they did is because the public believed at the time that the stated anti-corruption commitment by the government, particularly the government of Kibaki, was actually something that was capable of being carried out. What I think has happened in the time after that is that belief that something credible and tangible can be done against corruption, the belief has since waned, because after the massive public expenditure on unearthing the details of the Golden Bag scandal through the Commission of Inquiry, nothing really became of that effort. And as a friend of mine says, the Commission of Inquiry into the Golden Bag Commission was actually a burial ceremony for that scandal. Nothing, we needed a big ceremony, a big expensive burial ceremony for Golden Bag, and that became the Commission of Inquiry itself. So the public mind now is in this space where there are not that many people who think that there is still a capacity to do anything about corruption in this country. In the period after that, including the early period of Uhuru Kenyatta comes into power. He, in 2005, 2006, as the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, he leads a parliamentary inquiry into Anglo-leasing. That's how Anglo-leasing comes into the public space. They go to London as the Public Accounts Committee. They interview John Githongo in 2006. John is still in exile. They do a big report on Anglo-leasing, and Uhuru says, I mean, they're going to act as a parliamentary committee. But what does Uhuru do when he comes to power in 2013? He pays 1.4 billion to Anglo-leasing himself. That which he was fighting as PSC, a pending Anglo-leasing bill is paid under his watch. All that shows that the alliance, the corruption alliance, the capture alliance in this country has got unseen power, and that power is so strong that it moves presidents and the top leadership of this country from one position during one season of opposition to the kind of corrupt practices that are represented by, say, Anglo-leasing, to being to paying the same corrupt alliances themselves. Anti-corruption, a credible anti-corruption agenda is the result of an alliance between three elements. The first is political leadership. One has to have a political leadership that is committed to an anti-corruption agenda. Kibaki in 2003 was viewed by the public as sufficiently committed to anti-corruption, at least based on what they had said before they took power as NAC. They said enough to make people believe that they were interested in and could do something about anti-corruption. So, and since 2003, we have not had a political leadership that had public credibility against corruption in the way that Kibaki did. So that is the first element. The second element is you have to have in place a set of competent public institutions, whether they be anti-corruption commissions, whether they be the judiciaries, whether they be the media, and so on and so forth. So an alliance of competent public institutions is the second needed precondition to fighting corruption. The third is you have to have in place a supportive public opinion. You have to have a population that believes that it is important to fight corruption, and that also believes that it is possible to do so. The failure, the anti-corruption failures of the Kibaki regime have ultimately been particularly costly for the country, because Kibaki is the first president that came to power on an anti-corruption agenda, but then failed to do anything about corruption. What that did for the public is that it set the possibility, the belief that anything could be done against corruption very far back. Kenyatta, after Kibaki, didn't come to power on the basis he was going to fight corruption. He was just going to fight him and Ruto. They were just going to fight their cases against the ICC. That's the basis on which they took power the first time and kept power largely on that basis. And Ruto, going by what David Ndias told us, they disavowed any fight against corruption when they were campaigning for power 2 years ago. So they didn't promise anything against corruption, and they're clearly saying, don't hold us into account in the fight against corruption, because we are not going to do anything about it. We can't. So the point I'm making with this analysis is that alliance of the three sort of pillars, anti-corruption pillars, a conducive political leadership, a supportive public opinion, and a competent public institutions, and a supportive public opinion. That alliance of three pillars to fight corruption has actually frayed. It has collapsed. As a public, we don't believe it is possible to fight corruption. As a political leadership, we have a political leadership that says we don't care, we don't want to fight corruption. And what we then tend to try and do is to push the anti-corruption fight into the responsibility of these public institutions, whether they be the Anti-Corruption Commission, whether they be the courts, and so on and so forth. What could they ever do on their own? They can't. If as courts, as EACC or whatever it is, you try and do anything meaningful, credible against corruption, any long-ranging efforts that you do would actually be risky for your job, even for your life, depending on what the interests are. So what is the message for today? What is my message for today? We have to, the conversation has to be, how do we reinstate the alliance against corruption that is based on these three institutional support pillars that we have lost? Mwalimu has talked about what Gen Z did, how the government reacted to Gen Z, or seemed to react to Gen Z initially, and how they have quickly abandoned that reaction. It is as though Gen Z is, what Gen Z represented is a distant memory, something that is no longer a threat. That demonstrates the level of business. It's actually very, very difficult for political will to generate by itself. It is impossible because inside the political edifice, the interests that promote corruption are so entrenched, and there are so many, that if you start to do anything about it, even as the leadership itself, you will actually risk your own, you would risk regime survival. So it is easier for this government to try and fight truth tellers that are saying there's corruption and so on and so forth. It is less of a risk for them to to fight external enemies that are trying to hold them into account than to start anything credible against corruption, because everything they do on an everyday basis, from the bottom to the very top, is based on a perpetuation of their way of life. So we shouldn't expect that they can change. They are not capable of changing, and if they try to change, it will actually endanger the regime. That is why we had this promise. That's why we had a dissolution of cabinet, and a reappointment of the same cabinet, because if anything was done to shake up the cabinet in anything that was meaningful, the government would fall, because it is built on promises made to people that are based on it's a corrupt alliance. It is basically a corrupt alliance, and if you try to move one piece, everything will collapse, because all the pieces that are in will remind you, we had a deal before you took power. We came to power together. It was based on this deal. This is my piece of the deal. And if I'm not going to get my piece of the deal, I'm going to incite all the other people, or I'll go and speak to I'll go Ndatoboa, or whatever it is that people will do. So if we understand it that way, I think then it explains the moment where we are in, and it explains the need, I hope, for us to regroup in the fashion that I'm hoping that we can, in terms of how do we reignite a true anti-corruption alliance that is based on an identification of the weaknesses and that have gotten us to this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George.